They sat around a table polished with power, numbers dancing in their eyes, egos heavier than the gold on their wrists. Quiet room. Expensive silence. Then your name landed there. Unexpected, uncomfortable. Not because you're rich, but because you're inevitable. Billionaires don't fear noise. They fear disruption. And you changed the math without asking permission. They didn't vote out of respect. They decided out of survival. Because when people like them notice you, it's already too late. Your name didn't walk into those rooms politely. It slipped in like a bad joke nobody wanted to laugh at, scribbled itself onto agendas written in gold ink, echoed between walls that have only ever heard obedient voices. These are rooms where names are inherited, purchased, protected. And yours didn't belong there, which is exactly why it landed so hard. You weren't invited. You were noticed. There's a difference, and they felt it the moment the conversation paused just a second too long. They're used to controlling narratives, shaping futures with signatures and smiles, deciding who matters before the world even gets a vote. They like patterns. Predictable people. Clean trajectories. And then you showed up without following the script, without respecting the hierarchy, without understanding your place. At least that's what they told themselves at first. They thought it was a glitch, a temporary error in the system, something they could ignore until it corrected itself. But glitches don't keep growing. Glitches don't keep winning. Glitches don't make powerful people uncomfortable. Your name kept resurfacing. In reports they skimmed too quickly. In numbers that didn't make sense. In conversations that started with laughter and ended in silence. Someone mentioned you casually, like it was nothing, like it was a joke. And jokes are dangerous when they stop being funny. Especially when everyone in the room realizes they're laughing a little too loud to hide the tension. That's when your name stopped being entertainment and started becoming a problem. They didn't see you coming because you didn't look like a threat. No crown. No spotlight. No permission slip. Just momentum, just movement, just results stacking quietly while they were busy applauding themselves. And nothing irritates powerful people more than realizing the real shift happened while they were distracted. Their faces stayed calm, their voices steady, but inside, calculations, revisions. Emergency mental meetings where egos argue with reality. You became a variable they couldn't remove, a story they couldn't control, a question mark scribbled in the margins of their certainty. They tried to define you so they could dismiss you, called you lucky, temporary, overhyped, but definitions didn't stick. Every label peeled off the moment new evidence walked in. Your name didn't need defending. It kept answering for itself. Numbers have a cruel sense of humor like that. They don't care who you know. They just show up and expose the truth. At some point, your name stopped being spoken lightly. It required context, explanations, careful tone. They leaned back in their chairs, folded their arms, pretended this was all very interesting, very normal. But interest is just fear wearing a better suit. And fear gets louder the more you try to suppress it. You could feel it in the way the room shifted, in the way decisions slowed, in the way confidence hesitated. This wasn't admiration. This wasn't respect. This was recognition. The most honest kind. The kind that happens when denial finally gets tired. Your name entered those elite circles, not because you knocked, but because the door couldn't stay closed anymore. Because pretending you didn't exist was becoming more expensive than acknowledging you. Because ignoring you was no longer a strategy. It was a risk. They didn't announce it publicly. Of course not. Power never admits surprise. But behind closed doors, behind rehearsed smiles, behind the illusion of control, your name sat there like a loaded punchline. Uncomfortable, unavoidable, waiting. Power doesn't react to noise. It reacts to patterns. Loud people come and go. Trends rise and collapse. Hype burns fast and leaves nothing but ash. The kind of power that lasts watches quietly, waits patiently, counts carefully. And that's why they didn't notice you at first. You weren't screaming for attention. You weren't begging for validation. You were moving in ways that didn't trigger alarms, growing in places they weren't even looking at, building pressure where no spotlight reached. They measure importance by visibility, by headlines, by applause. And you gave them none of that. You stayed in the blind spots where real work happens and egos don't bother to look. While they were busy competing with each other, proving dominance in rooms full of mirrors, you were stacking proof. Small wins that didn't look dangerous alone, but together started forming something inconvenient. Influence that didn't ask to be seen. Influence that didn't need permission. At first, your growth felt like background noise, a minor ripple in a massive ocean of power. Someone mentioned it in passing, just a footnote, just an observation. Nothing worth stopping the meeting for. But repetition has a way of sharpening attention. The same name, again. The same outcome, again. The same quiet expansion that refused to stall. And power, real power, hates repetition it can't explain. They began to notice the absence before the presence. The way certain spaces changed without them touching anything. The way decisions elsewhere suddenly didn't bend as expected. The way people listened differently, hesitated differently, aligned differently. Influence is strange like that. You don't see it arrive. You notice it when control starts slipping, and you can't remember when it began. You weren't overthrowing anything. You weren't challenging them directly, and that made it worse. Because direct threats can be crushed. Wars can be declared. Enemies can be named. But what do you do with someone who isn't fighting you, yet keeps moving the board? Someone who doesn't seek dominance, yet somehow shifts gravity. That kind of growth doesn't trigger pride. It triggers unease. Their instincts woke up before their egos allowed them to admit it. Subtle changes in tone, longer pauses, more questions than answers. Power always senses danger before it understands it. It's a survival reflex sharpened by generations of losing and winning. And that reflex started pointing in your direction. not with panic, with curiosity edged in caution. They watched you more closely now. Not openly, of course. Surveillance disguised as interest. Analysis masked as admiration. They wanted to know how something so quiet could move so much. How someone without a seat at the table could still influence where the table stood. How growth could happen without the usual signs they were trained to recognize. And the more they observed, the clearer it became that this wasn't accidental. This wasn't luck. This was consistency, direction, an understanding of leverage that didn't rely on volume or force. You weren't rising in bursts. You were advancing in layers. Slow enough to avoid attention. Fast enough to stay ahead. That balance unsettled them more than any loud challenger ever could. Power noticed you the way predators notice a shift in the forest. No announcement. No explanation. Just a sudden awareness that something had changed, and pretending otherwise would be foolish. You didn't announce your presence. You didn't demand recognition. You simply became impossible to ignore. And that's when the watching turned serious, the calculations turned quiet, and the smiles stopped reaching their eyes. They always assume money comes first, that the weight of a bank balance creates gravity. That influence is something you buy in bulk and distribute like favors. That belief keeps them comfortable. It gives them a formula. Step 1, get rich. Step 2, get heard. Step 3, get feared. Simple, clean, wrong. Because long before wealth shows up, something else moves ahead of it. Something quieter, something far more dangerous. You didn't arrive with excess. You arrived with effect. People adjusted when you spoke, even when you didn't raise your voice. Decisions bent slightly after your involvement, even when your name wasn't on the document. Rooms changed temperature when you entered, not because of status, but because of certainty. That kind of presence can't be purchased. It's earned through alignment, through clarity, through knowing exactly where you stand, while everyone else is still negotiating with themselves. They couldn't attach a price tag to you, and that confused them. No obvious leverage, no flashy symbols, no desperate need to impress. Just a steady trail of reactions following your actions. Influence is measured by what happens when you leave the room, and long before wealth entered the conversation, outcomes were already whispering your name. That's what unsettled them. The realization that power had begun forming around you without money leading the way. You didn't command attention. You redirected it. People started referencing your ideas instead of the loudest voice. They started pausing before dismissing something you had touched. Not out of loyalty, out of instinct. Influence works like that. It spreads through trust, through repetition, through reliability. It doesn't announce itself. It embeds. And by the time wealth arrives, influence has already rearranged the landscape. They watched carefully, trying to spot the source. Surely there had to be backing. A sponsor. A shadow investor. Some hidden pipeline of resources. But every trail led back to the same uncomfortable answer. You were the source. Your thinking. Your timing. your refusal to chase approval. You weren't waiting to be rich to matter. You were already shaping outcomes, and wealth was just lagging behind, trying to catch up. That flips the hierarchy they rely on. Because if influence can exist without wealth, then wealth isn't the gatekeeper they thought it was. It becomes a multiplier instead of a requirement, and multipliers are dangerous in the wrong hands. Someone with influence before money doesn't need permission once money arrives. They don't ask. They don't negotiate their relevance. They expand. Your restraint was louder than their extravagance. While others used money to force attention, you used precision to earn it. You spoke when it mattered. You moved when it counted. You stayed silent when silence carried more weight than words. That discipline made people lean in, made them listen differently, made them trust the signal instead of the noise. Influence before wealth also meant independence. You weren't owned by expectations. You didn't owe allegiance to old systems just because they funded you. Your decisions weren't softened by gratitude or fear of losing access. That freedom is intoxicating and terrifying to those who built their power on dependency. They could sense it. You weren't manageable. You weren't buyable. Not yet. And maybe not ever. When wealth eventually brushed against your name, it didn't define you. It followed you. Like a shadow trying to keep up with the body that cast it. And that reversal is what forced them to reconsider you entirely. Not as someone climbing toward power, but as someone power was already orbiting. Money just made it visible. Influence had been there all along, quietly shaping reactions, quietly shifting outcomes, quietly proving that dominance doesn't always announce itself with numbers on a screen. Fear never looks like fear in powerful rooms. It dresses itself in logic, in caution, in strategic thinking. It clears its throat and calls itself responsibility. When they made decisions about you, they didn't say your name with panic. They said it with concern, with curiosity, with that tight smile people wear when they realize the ground under them isn't as solid as it used to be. They told themselves this was just risk management, just staying ahead, just being smart. But fear has a funny habit of leaking through the cracks. You could hear it in the sudden urgency, the rushed timelines, the way options that were once dismissed became worth exploring. Fear makes powerful people flexible in ways pride never allows. And suddenly, they were bending. They weren't afraid of what you had. They were afraid of what you didn't need. You weren't asking for approval. You weren't chasing their validation. You weren't dependent on their doors staying open. That independence rattled them more than aggression ever could. Because aggression can be resisted, independence can't be controlled. And control is the oxygen they breathe. Every decision they made around you carried an edge. Not boldness, not confidence, preservation. They weren't trying to win anymore. They were trying not to lose. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. When fear enters the equation, creativity dies and reflex takes over. They started choosing safety over dominance, containment over expansion, response over initiative. They reviewed scenarios where your influence grew unchecked. They imagined outcomes they couldn't steer, futures where their relevance slowly eroded, not with a bang, but with a shrug. Fear hates slow endings. It prefers drama. But you weren't dramatic. You were gradual, relentless. And that made their calculations heavier, their nights shorter. They asked questions they never needed to ask before. Who's backing this? How far does it go? What happens if we don't act? Fear always demands action, even when action makes things worse. Especially then. So they acted, quietly, carefully. They framed moves as opportunity while their instincts screamed defense. Some of them argued you weren't a threat. Not yet. Others insisted, not yet, is how disasters begin. Fear loves division. It fractures certainty, turns unified power into committees and hesitation. While they debated, you moved. While they analyzed, you adapted. And every delay fed the very outcome they were trying to avoid. They tried to neutralize you with proximity, bring you closer, observe, influence the influence. Fear often pretends to be friendliness. But you could feel the tension under the politeness, the careful wording, the way conversations circled instead of landing. They weren't listening to understand. They were listening to predict, to prepare. And still, they couldn't pin you down. You didn't react the way fear expects. You didn't speed up when pressured. You didn't slow down when watched. You didn't flinch when tested. That consistency terrified them. Fear depends on reactions, on tells, on cracks. You gave it none. So the decisions kept coming, layered, compounded, each one trying to regain a sense of control that was already slipping. They adjusted structures, shifted alliances, redefined priorities, all orbiting one unspoken truth they refused to say out loud. These weren't decisions made from vision. They were decisions made from survival instinct. Because when power starts making choices to protect itself instead of expand itself, it's already on the defensive. And fear, no matter how expensive the suit it wears, always leaves fingerprints on everything it touches, especially when the person it fears never even raises their voice, never declares war, never asks for permission, just keeps moving forward while the room quietly rearranges itself around them, wondering when exactly the balance tipped, and realizing too late that the decision wasn't about stopping you. It was about delaying the moment. They would have to accept that the game was no longer being played on their terms, and fear had already chosen for them. They live by permission, even when they pretend they don't. Boards approve, markets respond, systems validate. Every move is framed, justified, cleared by layers of agreement, so no one ever has to own the risk alone. Permission is how power protects itself, and you didn't ask for any. That's what set everything off. Not rebellion, not defiance, indifference. You didn't wait for the green light. You didn't lobby for acceptance. You moved as if the door had never been locked in the first place. That kind of behavior short-circuits systems built on control. Because systems can punish disobedience, but they struggle with people who never acknowledge the rules to begin with. You didn't break them. You stepped around them. They expected hesitation, some sign you understood the hierarchy, a pause, a request, a compromise. Instead, you chose action, clean, direct, unapologetic. Not reckless, just decisive. Disruption doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives calmly, does the thing everyone said couldn't be done, and leaves before anyone figures out who was supposed to approve it. That's when the word problem started floating around. Not out loud, not officially, but in the spaces between sentences. In the way eyebrows lifted. In the way conversations stalled when your name came up. You weren't disrupting markets. You were disrupting authority. You were proving that momentum doesn't need validation to exist. They tried to understand you through their own logic. Surely there must be a reason you didn't ask. Youth, ignorance, arrogance, temporary confidence. They labeled it anything that made it feel containable. Because if what you were doing was intentional, then it meant the old leverage points weren't working anymore. And that possibility made them deeply uncomfortable. You didn't disrupt by force. You disrupted by outcome. Results have a cruel way of embarrassing permission structures. Every success you had without approval made the approvals themselves look ornamental, decorative, like crowns on people who hadn't ruled in a while. And nothing scares authority more than looking unnecessary. They started reacting instead of leading. Policies adjusted after your moves. Narratives reframed to catch up. Standards rewritten so they could pretend they had planned for this all along. Disruption doesn't need to announce itself when it can make everyone else rearrange their story around it. What really disturbed them wasn't that you ignored permission. It was that others noticed. People watching you began to question why they were still waiting, why they were still asking, why they were still negotiating their own momentum. You didn't just move forward. You made stillness look optional. They couldn't punish you without admitting weakness. They couldn't absorb you without legitimizing your method. You existed in that irritating middle space where every response felt like a loss. So they hesitated. And hesitation, when faced with decisive action, is surrender stretched out over time. You weren't trying to overthrow anything. That would have been easier to handle. Revolutions can be crushed or co-opted. But you weren't fighting the system. You were bypassing it. You were showing that relevance doesn't come from alignment. It comes from effectiveness. And effectiveness doesn't wait for meetings to end. Disruption like that doesn't look chaotic. It looks efficient. Quiet, almost boring, until you realize how much has changed, while everyone was still debating whether change was allowed. You didn't ask for a seat. You didn't flip the table. You built something elsewhere and let the table become optional. They still talk about order, about process, about how things are supposed to work. But every time your name comes up, there's a pause where everyone remembers that the most disruptive force in the room wasn't rebellion. It was someone who acted like permission was a courtesy, not a requirement, and kept moving while the rest were still waiting for a nod that never came. They didn't clap for you. They didn't congratulate you. They didn't even admit it out loud. Acceptance at that level never sounds like praise. It sounds like silence that lingers too long, like plans rewritten without explanation, like eyes tracking you when they're pretending not to care. Your rise didn't need confirmation from them, but confirmation came anyway, buried inside their behavior. They stopped treating you like a phase. Phases burn out. Trends fade. They waited for that. Watched closely, patiently, convinced time would handle the inconvenience for them. But time didn't cooperate. Instead of shrinking, you stabilized. Instead of slowing down, you refined. Instead of chasing more, you became sharper. That's when inevitability entered the room, uninvited, unapologetic. Inevitability is terrifying because it removes choice. You can fight a rival. You can buy an opponent. You can outlast a trend. But what do you do when something is clearly on a trajectory that doesn't require your consent? You adjust. You prepare. You adapt. And adaptation is a quiet confession that resistance has failed. They started factoring you in, not as a hypothetical, not as a risk, as a constant. You became part of the equation, whether they liked it or not. Future decisions curved slightly around your presence. Strategies shifted. Timelines compressed. Opportunities once reserved for familiar names suddenly expanded to make room. That's not generosity. That's recognition wearing a neutral face. They noticed how others responded to you, how alignment formed naturally, without pressure, how loyalty wasn't bought, it was volunteered, how people spoke your name differently now, with certainty instead of curiosity. Influence had matured into gravity, and gravity doesn't argue. It pulls. The most telling sign wasn't what they said, it was what they stopped saying. No more dismissive jokes. No more casual doubt. No more, "we'll see." Those phrases disappeared because they no longer fit the evidence. Skepticism requires uncertainty, and uncertainty had run out of room. Your progress had closed too many doors behind it. They didn't need to crown you. Crowns are symbolic. Symbols are for spectators. This was practical. They adjusted their posture, changed how they approached conversations, measured words more carefully. Power doesn't bow, but it does lean back when it realizes the balance has shifted, and pushing forward might cost more than it's worth. You weren't celebrated because celebration implies permission granted. This was something else, a recalibration, a silent update to how the world works now. They didn't choose you. They acknowledged you. And acknowledgement from that level isn't emotional. It's operational. Your rise forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth about themselves. That their dominance wasn't absolute. That their control had limits. That the future doesn't always ask, who built the past before it moves on? You became proof that systems age, hierarchies soften, and new centers of influence form without announcements. They watched you with a different expression now. Not suspicion, not hostility, awareness. The look people get when they know resistance is pointless and imitation would be too obvious. You had crossed the line where reaction turns into accommodation, where denial turns into planning. You didn't arrive suddenly. That's the irony. You rose slowly enough to avoid alarms, steadily enough to avoid collapse, confidently enough to avoid doubt. And when they finally looked up from their own reflections, you were already there, not asking to be acknowledged, not demanding space, just occupying it naturally, effortlessly, like you'd always belonged there, like the room had been rearranging itself for a while. And they were only just now realizing that the inevitable thing they'd been preparing for wasn't some distant threat. It was already standing in front of them, calm, unmoved, fully aware that recognition wasn't the goal. It was merely the moment everyone else caught up to what had already been decided long before they ever spoke your name.